Jingawalla and welcome to Tales of Tweed. My name is Arabella and I'm here with you every Wednesday morning at 10:30am. I am going to take you on a journey this month, the month of May, that will end on the 3rd of June, which is the significant day known as Mabo Day. So I'm going to take the opportunity through the month of May over the next 4 weeks to educate you and share with you the meaning of Mabo Day. And that will include issues such as native title, First Nations rights that fall out of the United Nations Declaration for Indigenous People, and also talk about the history, which is today's week, about colonial impact and First Nations relationship with the Crown or with Britain. And so today we're going to explore that notion and talk about how treaties existed from about the 1400s onwards, and then we're going to journey each week over the month of May so that by the 3rd of June, which is Mabo Day, you have a clearer understanding about the significance of the decision of the High Court decision known as Mabo in Australia, and also the significance of what is known as native title that fell out of that judgment from the High Court of Australia. For the beginning of this week, we're going to talk about the epicentre of London and of Britain and how it was moving and both colonising and exploring the broader world. And the reason I'm going to start in that direction is because that's the first notion of engagement with First Nations people. And I want to take you through a journey of how Britain has operated since about the 1400s and then into the 1600s when they entered into the Americas. So the 1400s, by the 1400s in London, Tahitians, people from closer to our side of the world than the Northern Hemisphere, were already visiting London. And that's kind of significant and really important when you think about the relationship with First Nations people. It's significant because the person who had the diplomatic role, a Tahitian person who came to London, started engaging and talking about the countries in the Southern Hemisphere, was met with both an appetite of curiosity and, I guess, welcoming, an attitude of exploration and excitement about potentially what the countries across the world could begin to enjoy and share. Then we move forward rather rapidly to about the 1600s when Britain was first involved in America and actually exploring what indigenous people call Turtle Island, but of course North America and then South America and the Mexican nations that are really the First Nations of the southern part of America. And then of course as you go to First Nations through America up to the northern parts of America known as Canada, and you also have the existence of First Nations people there. What's particularly interesting is because those relationships began in the 1500s and more importantly in the early 1600s, that was the first time that Britain had the opportunity to begin to make treaties and relationships with First Nations people, and they proceeded to do that. America, if you look at Google Scholar at any point of what I'm talking about through this series, but if you search Google Scholar for the treaties that were negotiated in America, you will see a number of them. They kind of number about 400, sometimes 500, depending on the years that you're looking at. And what it is a constant negotiation with First Nations people that were already existing as the world was moving and shaping. It's really important to contextualize that and have that in your mind, because by the time we come into Australia, and Britain is then first coming into Australia from 1788, you then begin to understand how we went through a legal process that eventually led to Mabo, which was, again, the refuting of terra nullius, so a legal doctrine which meant that there were no people there. So for the moment and for this week, we're going to stay in London, and you're going to begin to see London and Britain as an epicentre of trade and relationships with First Nations people from North America, from Tahiti, eventually from Australia and including New Zealand and other parts of the world. And in that time, there were discussions and decisions made about how it was that trade would be negotiated, how it was that exchange would be negotiated, and there was very much an openness about sharing opportunities and sharing information. There's a very famous story of course, people might know Pocahontas, who in fact was from the Americas and ended up leaving her life and living the rest of her life in London under the Anglo-Saxon name of Rebecca. But of course, that demonstrates this relationship between America and Britain, which pre-existed prior to British people coming into Australia and then beginning their negotiations and their discussions with First Nations people here. So this week and all through this month, we're going to be exploring the impact and the first connections of First Nations people and Indigenous territories, resources and knowledges as they were moving into London, and as London was beginning to experience and understand that there were multiple nations in the Southern Hemisphere yet to be explored, yet to be contacted, and thus began this kind of urgency of exploration. So my name is Arabella. I'm here every week, Tales of the Tweed. This week we're talking about London and their first relationship with First Nations people, which began around the 1500s and then accelerated in the 1600s with more activity through the Americas and a number of treaties and negotiations with First Nations people, as well as brutality, as well as inter-colonial fighting, and of course you end up having the wars first in the southern part, so the Texan War or the Mexican Wars in the southern part of America, which of course are First Nations people as you go into South America. And then of course, for those of you that don't know, that's kind of on the California side or the western side of the continent. And then of course, as colonial impact starts to take shape on the East Coast, which is kind of where New York is, and coming down from Canada in that part, you actually have significant trade with a man called Astor, who was a kind of a billionaire back in the day, who was trading fur skins and trading other bone and wooden artifacts with the Canadians and with the Northern American First Nations people. So their system of economy and trade was being brought into the Americas from a colonial perspective through New York and through those channels. And then on the West Coast, you have the Mexican and the push for rapid advancement across the territories from about the 1600s, and multiple nations having and sitting down and negotiating treaties with Britain. So it's really important to have that in your mind, that prior to 1788, at least for almost 200 years, Britain was already negotiating with First Nations people based on economic trade systems, based on land use, based on negotiations about how to share land. So that's interesting for the next part of next week, which is next Wednesday morning at 10:30. Well, we will then go on to explore in more detail the treaties that existed in the Americas in 1607 and moving forward. And I will also talk about the differences between the northern part of America, or Turtle Island, which moves into Canada, First Nations people through that part, which actually connects up to other Inuit people and people in the Northern Hemisphere. And then, of course, I will start to explore the southern part of America, the wars that existed around what we now know as Texas and Arizona, the pushing and the trade down to South America, and the separation between those countries, which, of course, also eventually leads to the Civil War in America. So we're going to explore that because this week, we've covered the area of 1500s to 1600s. So 1500s, you need to be aware that First Nations people were travelling into London. They started to share and explore and talk about potential trade. In the 1600s, you see rapid advancement into America and the first behaviour of how the colonial and British apparatus would deal with treaties and First Nations, and the success and the failure of those treaties. So how they were negotiated, how it was resolved, how they were broken, and how conflicts erupted. And I'm going to take you on that journey next week in deeper detail. So by the third week of the month, we will actually get to around the early 1700s, and we will then reframe and re-explore how Britain engaged with its First Nations people from 1788. And I think the truth may be startling and new to some people, but it helps you contextualise why the High Courts who dealt with the matter later in the 1970s, which High Court matter that came actually out of the Northern Territory, and then eventually another High Court decision of Mabo, known as Mabo 1 and eventually Mabo 2, was an extension of that discussion. And I think this is important to contextualise Australia in that way, because I think as a community that wants to build cohesion and respect for each other, it's really important to understand that native title and matters such as Mabo and the High Court decision of Mabo are an extension of a very long discussion that has been on the British timetable for about 400 years. So if you understand that, then you're less likely to feel it was a knee-jerk reaction or it was an action that in fact was unusual or unique to Australia, and you'll see it for what it was, which is in fact an extension of what Britain had already accommodated with other nations and other First Nations people before. I hope you enjoyed this week's session. We're going to be talking about all things Mabo in the month of May. My name is Arabella, 101.3 FM, Tales of the Tweed. Please journey with me every Wednesday morning where we discuss in detail Mabo, native title, First Nations rights, so that we may journey as a community in understanding each other's history, and we may journey as a community in appreciating and respecting each other's history. Jingawala and Boogabear.